some sense of it all. But I can see it makes no sense at all. Is it cool to go to sleep on the floor? Did I think that I can take anymore? Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you.
All right, good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for session 2 of Becoming an Inclusion Changemaker presented by Sam Drazin. I'm Janelle Mercado, project coordinator with the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project, and on behalf of Kristen Brooks, executive director and co-director, Kevin Schaefer, our team from both Riverside and El Dorado counties, and the California Department of Education, we're so glad that you could be here this afternoon. We have so many participants on the line today, and we would like to invite you to participate and engage with us by using the chat box or the Q&A feature, where we'll have team members who will be monitoring throughout. We will be hosting a Q&A session at the end of today's session. So if you could drop your questions into the Q&A, we'll start to collect them, and Sam will address all of your questions at the end of the session. If you miss any portion of today's session, then you will receive a link to the recording and related resources in a follow-up email to the email address that you provided when you registered. Please be sure to check your junk or spam folders if you don't see the email come through within the next 24 hours or so. A Padlet link is going to be dropped in the chat for you right now by our team. And on the Padlet contains resource materials that have been collected and curated by Sam. And so you'll also find today's slides on the Padlet that is dropped in the chat. You'll also find a certificate of completion for proof of attendance that's located on the Padlet. And we will be sure to add any additional resources to that Padlet. A few times throughout this session, you'll see that Padlet come through. So if you lose it, it will be there for you in the chat. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sam. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Janelle. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. Very excited to be presenting to you all again. I see some familiar names in the participant list and some new names in the participant list. So for those of you who are joining us again for the second part of this series, welcome back. So glad to have you. And for those of you who are new, I'm excited to have you join this group of professionals who are motivated and engaged to really think about how could we create more inclusive learning environments for our students throughout the state of California. My name is Sam Drazin. I am a former elementary educator. I taught 3rd grade and 5th grade for a number of years. Worked with students with disabilities, worked at the middle school level for a little bit, so did a whole bunch of different things. Left the classroom about 7.5 years ago to pursue this work at more of a national level. So I present nationally, both in person and via Zoom, to educators, parents, students on issues of inclusion. And I'm also the founder and executive director of Changing Perspectives, an educational nonprofit. I really hope that this is not the end of my relationship with each one of you, but rather just the beginning. So I've included my email address on this slide, and you're also welcome to connect via social media platforms. And I have to say, one of the really neat things about hosting these webinars is, this is the 4th one we've done now, and I've actually had the chance to connect with several participants offline and learn more about their successes and their struggles when it comes to helping to create more inclusive environments for students with disabilities in their respective schools and districts. A little bit more about Changing Perspectives. We are an educational 501c3 nonprofit organization. We partner and collaborate with schools and organizations to promote social emotional learning and cultivate inclusive and equitable learning communities with a lens of students with disabilities. We do our work through curriculum resources we make available to schools, professional development trainings like this one this afternoon, as well as parent engagement workshops. Our website is up here on the screen, and social media is also a way that you can connect with us, learn more about what we're doing, and download resources. This afternoon, our agenda is really divided up into 4 areas. The first thing I want to do is review what we talked about last week in session 1, which was really what is inclusion and why is it important. Next, I want to build out and present to you one model to begin exploring inclusive practices in your school, which is what I call the inclusion checklist. Then after that, we'll talk about how do you get community buy-in within the stakeholders that make up your school or district community. And lastly, some tips and tricks for developing an action plan. For those of you who are just joining us, again, I want to encourage you to participate throughout the webinar using the chat feature or the Q&A. One of the things I've really enjoyed working with this group over the last month or so is how interactive you all are in the chat feature, sharing resources, suggestions, and using the Q&A to pop any of your questions in there. So last week, for session 1 of this series, we really focused on the what and the why of inclusion and inclusive education. For those of you who attended last week, this is a little bit of review. For those of you who didn't, hopefully this catches you up to speed. So I'm going to start in the green box in the upper left-hand corner. So last week, we really started by unpacking and defining what is inclusive education, and talking about that each one of us may have a different definition of inclusive education, and that our definitions may change over time, that there's some variability in it. The value and importance of creating a commonly understood definition of inclusion in your school or district could be really, really an important step in building out this work. After that, we talked a little bit about why inclusive education is a valuable kind of pragmatic way to move your systems, and the value of universal design for learning, the academic improvements of students both with and without disabilities when we create more authentically inclusive environments, as well as the social and emotional gains of all students. Following that, we unpacked a greater understanding of what is authentic inclusion. And as I said last week, I think when we ask leaders, when we ask teachers, when we ask whomever to create inclusive learning environments for students with disabilities, that could just feel like a huge weight falling on their shoulders. And it can feel very paralyzing and overwhelming. How do we do it? And so one way that I really like to think about it is how could we take this idea and chunk it into really bite-sized components. And so this idea of authentic inclusion is really made up of 3 components: academic inclusion, social inclusion, and physical inclusion. And if we can bite-size it in that way, whereas those of you who've been on these calls before know that I really like to talk about that 10% change, right? Like how can we always focus on making our schools just 10% more inclusive to achieve a greater goal? So just a quick recap and review from last session. Again, if you registered for last session, but you were unable to attend, you can get the recording. So to kick us off tonight, where we're really going to dive into the how, right? Last week was all about the what and the why of inclusion. This afternoon is the how. How do we do this? How do we begin? We're ready. We believe in it. We're in the right mindset. Where do we go from here? And so to kick us off, I'm going to ask you this question that this young child in the video asked, which is, are you ready to really include me? And as you watch this video, I'd love to hear your reactions in the chat about this video. I think it's a great 2-minute video just to really get us motivated and jump right in.
I don't understand why I'm at the back of the class. I wish I was like everyone else. I want to do what they are doing. But here I am, doing the same old number activity, watching as my classmates learn something else. Don't they know that they're setting me up to fail? Don't they know they hold my future in their hands? I want to work with my class, learn what they are learning, and do the activities they do. But here I am, stuck at the back, limited by low expectations. Having a one-on-one teacher aide just teaches me to rely on them and means I get less attention from the teacher. I am not included in the classroom. I am in the same room but segregated from my peers, sat to the side or back, working on different things and missing out. I want to be free to learn with my peers, reach my full potential and be seen to be like everyone else. I need something to change. You may be wondering what was wrong with this picture. I am in the classroom with my peers, sitting in my seat, learning the same things as everyone else. You may think this is inclusion, but it's not. I am stifled, limited, and held back from reaching my full potential. Though I love my teacher aide, I don't get to think for myself. In fact, a lot of the time, my teacher aide does it for me, even whispering the answer in my ear when I already know it. The more she is with me, the more I realize that there is no point in me thinking for myself because she will give me the answer anyway. I'm sure there are other kids who also need her help. Does she need to be with me? Can't she help others? Surely if I need help, I can put my hand up and ask my teacher like my friends do. My friends and classmates want to help me, but by having someone right next to me, they can't. I need to learn from my peers, be able to do group work and be challenged. I want to be allowed to fail or succeed and learn from it. I need something to change. Can you find me in the crowd? Inclusion is more than just a word. It is a culture, a mindset, and an expectation that everyone can and will learn and succeed along their age-appropriate peers. I know it can be challenging to include me in the learning as sometimes I might require extra resources and information, but giving me space to learn from my teacher and peers is the best way to challenge me and allow me to grow. I want to learn the same things as my classmates, and I want teachers to have the same expectations of me as my friends. My learning may need to be modified, but I still want the opportunity to show what I can do, not focus on what I can't. Treat me the same as any other student and watch me flourish. I will rise to the challenge of expectations you set for me. Are you ready to really include me?
What a great question to kick off this afternoon's webinar. Are you ready to really include me? So let's start with one tool that I like to call the inclusion checklist. The inclusion checklist is a tool that schools can use, districts can use to evaluate current successes and current challenges when it comes to the inclusive or exclusive environment of their systems. By taking the opportunity to do some evaluation, some data collection using this tool, data can really help us inform our solutions, right? We can think about academic, social, and physical inclusion, but if we don't know where we're already at to begin with, it can be hard to know where we're trying to go, right? Like that 10%, if we want to make our schools 10% more physically inclusive, 10% more academically inclusive, 10% more socially inclusive, maybe next school year, we need to figure out where we're starting in each of those categories. So this model of this inclusion checklist can really help us assess areas of current success where we're already doing really well, as well as where we have room to grow. It really provides us the foundation for strategic planning. If we want to figure out where we want to go, we need to first evaluate where we are. So those of you who've been with me before know that I love to intersperse what I find as kind of these inspirational inclusion quotes, if you will. I think quotes, hearing short little statements around inclusion from other people can be incredibly powerful in our own inspiration in this work. So this is from Claudia Brindwoody, and she says, inclusivity means not just we're allowed to be there, but we are valued. I've always said smart teams will do amazing things, but truly diverse teams will do impossible things. So when we think about an inclusion checklist, again, that might seem very, very big when I say, create a set of questions to assess where you're at when it comes to inclusivity in your school systems, right? Like, okay, but like, how do we begin? So just like we were able to chunk authentic inclusion into these 3 components, this is the way that I would recommend organizing your inclusion checklist. So in order of having, rather than having an inclusion checklist, which is just a long list of questions, let's organize those questions into 3 different categories. Questions that we can use to help us assess our current success in academic inclusion. Questions that we can use to assess our success in physical inclusion. And questions that we could use to assess social inclusion. So what are these questions? As we develop these questions, we also really want to be mindful of ensuring that we create questions that we can use to ask the various stakeholders within our school community. So in fact, you might end up having 1, 2, 3, or 4 different inclusion checklists. You might have an inclusion checklist that you use to assess an educator's perspective on where you stand when it comes to academic, social, and physical inclusion. You might have a different inclusion checklist that you ask students to respond to. And you might have a third academic inclusion checklist that you are asking families to respond to. So this goes back to some of our previous webinars when we think about making change, system-wide change, culture and community change. We really need to be mindful and aware that all of the stakeholders within our school community bring their own perceptions to this work. So to do a very kind of thought out and intentional inclusive checklist rollout, we really want to think about how are we asking questions? What questions can help us solicit information from which of our stakeholder groups? So when we think about academic inclusion and recognize this is just one section of our inclusion checklist, we're looking to ask folks questions around academic accessibility. How accessible is the academic content? Are there various ways that students can access the academic content? The other question we're looking at is academic participation. So it isn't just students being able to access the content, but it's how they participate in the learning with their peers. So for example, that video that we showed at the beginning of this afternoon's webinar, it showed the little girl doing similar work, but in the back of the room, away from her peers. So maybe the academics was accessible, but maybe the participation wasn't there. We also want to ensure that we're providing all students the opportunity to feel a sense of academic achievement. So what questions might you ask folks to ensure, maybe there's a question for educators around that, and the question for students is different. And lastly, diversity representation. Considering the representation, in other words, can students see themselves in the academic content, the posters, the images on the website you're going to, the workbooks, the literature? Is diversity and disability diversity represented in the academic content? So as we work through the inclusion checklist, we're really thinking about, within each of these 4 areas under academic inclusion, what questions would we be able to ask ourselves to get some benchmark information on how we're doing so far? How are we doing in making academics accessible? How are we doing in terms of ensuring multiple ways for students to participate? How are we doing in terms of making sure that all students feel a sense of academic achievement, not just those maybe gifted and talented kids? And how are we doing when it comes to diversity representation? Again, as I go through this, feel free to drop any comments, resources, thoughts, aha moments in the chat, and any questions in the Q&A. We're dedicating a lot of time after this presentation for Q&A, because I already see a lot of numbers going up there. When we think about the social inclusion section of this inclusion checklist, we want to be thinking about questions that we can ask ourselves, questions that we can ask our educators, questions we can ask our students, questions we can ask our families, to give us some valuable information on where we stand in terms of inclusive play. Do students feel like they have the opportunity to play inclusively with their peers with disabilities? Are students given explicit teaching and lessons around how to play with those who might be different than you? So really questions around both the opportunity for inclusive play and the knowledge and know-how around inclusive play. Now, from the teacher standpoint, we might be asking questions like, do teachers know how to facilitate inclusive play? We might also consider questions that really engage in an understanding of our sense of belonging, right? And that's kind of a tricky one because it's a little less tangible, right? But how can we ask questions for our educators, to our students, to our families, to solicit some information on kind of what is their sense of belonging in our learning community? Do they feel a sense of belonging? Do they not feel a sense of belonging? What does sense of belonging mean? The next one are questions that focus on ability to participate, right? So inclusive play, sense of belonging is different than our ability to participate. You know, is recess set up in a way where everyone can participate? Community in which diversity is valued. What is the sense of the community at the school? Does it promote diversity? Does it value differences, or does it really try to, channel every kid to be like every other kid? And also that everyone has a role. Is every student feel like they have a role in their school community? They have a place, they are participating to the level in which they choose, or it is appropriate for them to participate, and they have that role. So just to recap, within the inclusion checklist, we've got questions that we're asking perhaps educators, students, and families about academic inclusion, questions about social inclusion that may fit into some of these categories. Oops. Physical inclusion. So when we think about questions that we might ask on this checklist to gain some insight around how physically inclusive our school and learning communities are, we're really looking at questions that get information around the design of spaces and places. So simply the design of those spaces. Do those spaces provide an opportunity for all abilities to engage? And when I say spaces and places, I want us to really think beyond just the 4 walls of the gen ed classroom. I want you to really kind of deconstruct your school site and think about what are all the places and spaces, both inside and outside, from classrooms to bathrooms to library to gym, hallways, playgrounds, courtyards, cafeterias, right? Like all the places. In addition to the physical design, we also need to think about sensory inputs for success. Lighting, sound, smells, visual inputs. Are those sensory inputs designed to set students up for success? Or are those sensory inputs maybe still back in 1980 when the school was built and aren't necessarily really set up to support students? So we've got the design of the places, we have the sensory input in those places. The next two are around access. So access to all those spaces and places. Can all students physically get there? Once they get there, is it designed in a way that they can participate in a successful way? And then the other piece is access to materials. When we think about our classrooms, are the materials set up in a place where all students can access them? So to drill this down even more and hopefully not confuse or overwhelm anybody, when we think about this inclusion checklist, we think about dividing it up into these three sections, right? Academic, physical, and social inclusion. And on the previous three slides, I really walked you through some kind of big ideas that you might think about in terms of crafting questions to inventory where your school is in each of these three domains. Now, as we craft these questions, I really suggest dividing the questions up even further. So like we're drilling down a little bit more. We want to have blue questions and red questions. The blue questions are questions that we would use to assess our current success in those areas. And the red questions are questions that we would use to assess future progress in those areas. So for example, the difference between a blue and a red question. So for example, let's say under social inclusion, a question to assess current success is, do all students feel a sense of belonging, right? So we could have students respond yes or no and get some data. For a red question, it might be, what changes could be done by the school climate team to ensure that more students feel a sense of belonging? So we've got questions to assess current standing, and we have questions to assess future growth in each of those areas. So what we're going to do now is in the chat, we're going to drop a link to a Google Doc. This is an inclusion checklist template that I've put together for you as a tangible takeaway from this webinar. When you open up this link, if you go to, you can make a copy of this by going to File, Make a Copy, and then you can save this into your own drive. What we're going to do is put on some quiet music. We're going to give you about 5 minutes. What we'd like you to do, or what I'd like you to do in those 5 minutes, is start filling in this inclusion checklist. Again, don't worry about spelling, don't worry about overthinking it, just based on what I've shared with you about how this tool can be used to evaluate where your school or district stands and where you're trying to go within each of those three areas. I wanted to ensure that you had a little bit of time right now on the call while it's fresh in your mind, all these amazing ideas that I've shared with you, to start jotting them down. So again, we're going to give you 5 minutes. Make a copy of this so you have it in your own drive, and just reflect on what I've shared thus far and start brainstorming. All right. So I hope everybody was able to access that. I know some people in the chat are looking for a little tech support, and Dawn from Supporting Inclusive Practices is on it, giving some suggestions. So in the chat now, what I'd like you to do is just drop in a note. How do you see an inclusion checklist being a useful tool for you? One of the beauties of it, and oftentimes people ask me, like, you have an example, and I never give individuals examples of inclusion checklists because they're really personal to the school and the system and the goals that you're trying to achieve. And so what I'd love you to do is drop a line in the chat right now, answering the question, how do you see an inclusion checklist being a useful tool for you? And if you don't think it's a useful tool, that's okay. It's just the first tool we're talking about tonight. And it'll also be an opportunity to start sharing with each other kind of how different folks are viewing this tool. Oh, great. Thanks for getting us started there, Kelly. And I sent you an email earlier today. Yeah, I love that someone put objectivity in there, right? Like it's a way to look at systems and look at structures from a very bird's eye view perspective where, you know, this isn't personnel related, right? We're not talking about specific kids. We're not talking about specific educators. We're just thinking community-wise, where are we and where are we looking to go? And you can do these, I call them an inclusion checklist, but you can really use it as a survey. I'm working with one school district right now where we created an inclusion checklist and we put it up as a Google form, and we're gathering data from the 5th and 6th grade students across the district around their perceptions of how academically, physically, and socially inclusive their schools are as a starting point. So there's just so many different ways that you can use it. And I'm seeing a lot of people saying supporting goals, that it breaks it down, it makes it more, less overwhelming. It's just a really great way to start. And if you Google inclusion checklist, you will find examples that other schools have posted. So feel free to do that. I just don't tend to share them because I don't want people to be swayed one way or the other. I really want individuals to consider their school community, their needs, and really build from the ground up within the structure. So feel free to keep those comments coming as you have them. I hope that you find that Google Doc a useful tool. If you have trouble with the technology, reach out to us, and we can talk more about that. Want to share another quote this afternoon by Maya Angelou. It is time for parents to teach young people early on that in diversity there is beauty and there is strength. And I think we could also change parents to educators, right? It is time for educators to teach all people that in diversity there is beauty and there is strength. I've noticed over the last few sessions we've done that one of the common kind of comments / questions that are coming up from our participants and attendees is, I'm sharing resources with my staff. I'm sharing resources with my principal. I'm sharing resources with my colleagues, but I can't get people to really buy into this, right? And the inclusion checklist is a great tool to kind of figure out where we are and just kind of start to get some structure in unpacking this work. But how do we actually engage and get some community buy-in for the value of understanding of, importance of, et cetera, inclusive environments? So I think when we think about community buy-in, we can think about community buy-in into these 3 different ways, right? The first thing we have to do is we need to educate. because we're never going to get community buy-in on something that people don't understand or are ignorant to or have zero knowledge of. So when we think about a rollout or a strategy for gaining community buy-in, and again, community buy-in, I'm going to go back to that previous slide. We need buy-in from all of those stakeholders. And there's probably a fourth stakeholder, which would be leadership, right? We need leadership buy-in, we need educator buy-in, we need student buy-in at the end of the day. We need family buy-in. So the first step is we've got to educate. We've got to ensure that everybody has the common understanding and knowledge about what we're talking about. And this probably goes back to the first two webinars I did here for supporting inclusive practices around what is disability, what are our perceptions of disability. So we've got to educate. After we educate, we get people like, okay, like I think I kind of understand this. People are kind of like, so what can I do, right? Like the so what, the how. And that's the next piece, which is empower. We need to empower individuals that they do possess the power to make change. Whether that's teachers in their classroom, whether that's parents at home, whether that's students on the playground and are in their neighborhood, or whether that's principals or leadership, right? We all do have the power to create more authentically inclusive environments. We really, really do. So then the last step is we have to inspire, all right? We have to inspire people. We have to get people intrinsically motivated. We've got to give people the structures and the tools like those inclusion checklists to really inspire them to go out and make those changes, to start putting new practices in place, to start thinking about that 10% each year, 10% each year. So I just think when people kind of, oftentimes folks say to me like, I'm sharing resources, I don't know what to do, right? We've got to think about this as a very scaffolded and intentional approach. Just like we scaffold our academics for our students, we need to scaffold the way in which we engage and get community buy-in from educate, empower, and inspiration. So let's talk about some of the specific ways we can do this. One way to start empowering individuals is through that inclusion checklist for all stakeholder groups, right? So the inclusion checklist is not an educate sort of area, and it's not necessarily an inspiration area, right? It's an empower. It's, okay, we've got some common language, we can start doing this assessment. In order to educate folks, we need to provide professional development training for educators. And when I say educators, I'm talking all educators, right? We're talking certified staff, paraprofessionals, we're talking interventionists, we're talking unified arts teachers. We've really got to encompass everybody in this work. Reach out to other schools in your district or in your area. Ask them if they've started any inclusive practices. What's working, what's not. One of the best ways to inspire schools to make change is to show examples of other schools that have made the change. Hear the stories, hear what worked, hear what didn't. So really think about ways in which that you can engage and invite others in your areas to come to your school and share. Facilitate family workshops, right? We've got to make sure that all families, parents of students with and parents of students without disabilities, understand the how and the why of this work. And lastly, we do need to continue to share resources on the topic, but I think we need to be really, really mindful of how we do it, especially in our kind of pandemic world, Zoom fatigue that people are feeling right now. So what I found is that just sending emails out with click this link, or forwarding things, that doesn't work. That's not an effective way to share resources because people are overwhelmed by that, right? We need to think about creating one virtual hub that is going to be the go-to place for resources that are organized in a manner that is very easy and intuitive for folks to interact with. And so really consider who in your school, who in your district could help you create that hub. How do you manage that hub? How do you continue to get it out there? Because then you're sharing one link to one place that's organized. So again, to kind of recap, as we think about community buy-in, we want to think about it in a long-term plan, right? You might not do educate, empower, and inspire all in a year. It could be next year is the year of education. The year after that is the year of empowerment. And the year after that is the year of inspiration, right? So we really want to be mindful and thoughtful. And, we're all busy. Everybody is running unlimited bandwidth right now, right? Like, let's not overwhelm ourselves. Let's really think about how can we take this work in these bite-sized chunks. We know what our ultimate goal is, and the working backwards in there and thinking about these strategies in ways that we can educate, empower, inspire, and get that community buy-in that we need. So this afternoon, we've talked about the inclusion checklist as a tool. We've talked about community buy-in as another strategy. The next thing is, how do you develop a plan? How do you develop a plan to start building out inclusive practices in your school or learning community? Now, if you Google creating a plan for inclusive education, you're going to get 9 million different things. There are lots and lots of different templates, structures, strategies, consultants that can help schools with this. What I'm doing this afternoon is I want to share with you a very, very simple 3-part plan. I recognize that for some of you, this might be enough to take away. For others of you, this might not be enough. I recognize for some of you, all 3 parts are going to fit perfectly into kind of the way in which you work and your role at your school or district. And I recognize for others of you, it's not. So, take what I'm going to share with a grain of salt, take away what could work for you. So if I wanted to come up with a very simple 3-part inclusion plan, I would say part 1 is about data collection and evaluation. Part 2 is about coming up, creating, articulating a mutually understood common vision for inclusive education in your learning community, shared amongst all stakeholders. And part 3 would be documenting the actual plan. Again, for those of you who are joining us, feel free to drop any thoughts, comments in the chat, drop questions in the Q&A. And this slide deck is on the Padlet. So if you want to screenshot this, go ahead, but you can also go into the Padlet and download these slides specifically. So what is step 1, data collection? Data collection is about determining the areas of current need and needed improvement in your school setting, right? So this is essentially that inclusion checklist that we spent a good chunk of time at the beginning of this afternoon's webinar talking about. So the inclusion checklist can really, really help with that data collection. When we think about what information we are collecting, we're collecting information on current mindsets of disability and inclusion. We're collecting information on our understandings of this work and the value of inclusive practice. And then we're also collecting information on our actual current practice, which a lot of the examples that I gave in the earlier slides, unpacking academic, social, and physical inclusion, really focused on the current practice, right? What are we doing? What are we not doing? What's the structure? What's our lighting like in the school? Do kids feel a sense of belonging? But we may also want to think about questions around, how comfortable are you with students with disabilities? How do you feel like you have enough training working with students with disabilities, right? Questions like that can help us tap into current mindset that folks have, bias stereotypes of students with disabilities. We want to consider, as part of an evaluation and data collection process, collecting data from various stakeholders in the school community, right? Like if you just survey gen ed teachers, you're going to get one perspective. If you just survey your special educators, you're going to get a different perspective. If you just survey your administrative team, you're going to get a different perspective. So we really want to think about how we collect data from all of the stakeholders in the school community because that can help us figure out, okay, what is the common alignment? Where are folks feeling and seeing things in the same way? And where are there some pretty big gaps in understanding mindset, value, and current practice? Another big piece that I like to think about as part of the data collection and evaluation process is when we start looking at the information that we receive, it can really help us to think about what resources are going to be needed in moving forward with a successful plan, right? We recognize that schools are strapped for time. Schools are usually strapped for money. Schools are strapped with teaching staff. Schools are strapped with physical resources. Schools are strapped with physical space. You only have so much space in your school. So I think it's really important before folks start saying, well, we can't do this, we can't do this, we can't do this, kind of think more about what are the resources we would need to do this. Do we need more time? Do we need more staff? Do we need more training? Do we need an extra classroom? Do we need more different types of light bulbs, right? Like, what are the resources that we would need in order to be successful, rather than just focusing on all the things we don't have that won't let us be successful? So step one is figuring out how you want to roll out some opportunities to collect meaningful data and then evaluate that data. And using that inclusion checklist tool can be a really great way to do it. Number two, articulate a common vision. If each stakeholder in your school community has a different definition and vision of inclusive education in your school system, you've got a big problem. And it's going to be really, really hard to put a plan into action. So I think it's so valuable to take the time to ensure that there's a common understanding of the key terms that you're using, that you build a common mindset about this work, and that school communities, districts, learning communities craft a vision statement that is universal and publicly accessible, right? You know how schools always say, oh, we have a mission statement. Everybody knows the mission statement. I challenge you to ask every teacher in that school and every student in that school, what's your school's mission statement? Most people don't know. And if your school does, if I'm wrong, kudos to your school for doing that. So it's really, really important that we craft a vision statement, inclusive education at Apple Lane Elementary School is whatever. Main Street Elementary School values diversity. Our school looks like, feels like, and sounds like to create an inclusive environment for all students, right? All abilities. Come up with a vision statement, a mission statement, a goal statement, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't really matter what it's called, but make sure that you've got that statement, that messaging clear, and that everybody understands it and everybody knows it, or everybody has the opportunity to get to know it and ask questions and understand it. Because if all of your stakeholders can all recite that and truly understand what it means, that's going to be hugely impactful in moving this plan forward. And if anybody out there on this webinar this afternoon has a statement that your school already uses, feel free to drop it in the chat. I'd love to, let's start to see what other people are playing around with, or if you have an idea of it, or go back to last week's webinar, the recorded version we did about definition of inclusion, and kind of walking through that process, because I gave some suggestions last week on how to do that. Number three, we've got to create a plan. So we spent time figuring out how we're going to collect some information, evaluate that information on where we stand and where we want to go. We've worked on crafting a clear end goal, a vision, a mission, a looks like, sounds like, feels like in our school around inclusive education. The next thing we need to do is document a plan. And as we all know in schools, each year there seems to be a new initiative, right? And I remember when I was a teacher, you start those pre-service days in the fall, and it's this year's initiative is X, and you do all that year, and then the next year we're on to the next one. So when we create a plan, we want to come up with a reasonable timeline for the plan. It could be a 5-year plan. It could be a 1-year plan. It could be a week-by-week plan. It could be a month-by-month plan. You've got to work and you've got to consider your community and what's going to work. It's what's going to work best for you and your school. So make sure that your plan includes a very reasonable timeline, an achievable timeline. Within that timeline, I would really map out what are the roles and responsibilities for each of your stakeholders. So, if one of your goals in your timeline is creating more inclusive play on the playground, all right, what is the role of students in that? What is the role in educators in that? What's the role in playground supervision staff in that? What's the role in administrators in that? What's the role in families in that, right? So you start building out almost like a matrix where you have like, okay, here's the thing we're going to do. Here are all of the stakeholders going up top, and here are all their roles and responsibilities in each cell below. That can help us to really think about and consider how it takes a village to really create an inclusive school. I also would really recommend mapping out those resources needed. What are those resources that you are going to need for each item on your plan, right? So if an item on your plan is to provide multiple seating opportunities within each classroom to be more inclusive, so you have regular chairs, you have those ball chairs, you have those T chairs, right? So what are the resources that you need? You're going to need resources to purchase that equipment, right? If your goal is that we want to ensure that, all of our gen ed teachers understand more about differentiating instruction for students with disabilities, we need professional development. So making a list of what are those resources needed, both tangible physical resources and those intangible resources, whether that's training, whether that's time, whether that's a mindset shift. And then lastly, really ensuring that you have measurable outcomes in your plan, right? So how are you going to go back to your plan and evaluate success or unsuccess of each of the parts of your plan to help move you to your full mission? I would really suggest that this can feel very overwhelming, right? I feel like the inclusion checklist is very structured, creating your vision is very structured, and then you get to this and it's a little bit, oh my goodness. But trust me, if you take the time to do a very well thought out inclusion checklist rollout, and if you take the time to build out that vision statement, this part will actually come relatively easy, because you already know, based on the information on the inclusion checklist, what you need to put in your plan. And you already know what your end vision is, right? So then it's really just about building out the timeline, who's responsible, and what resources you need to achieve those goals. So another quote I wanted to share is from Melinda Gates. Melinda says, "We all want something to offer. This is how we belong. It's how we feel included. So if we want to include everyone, we have to help everyone develop their talents and use their gifts for the good of the community. That's what inclusion means. Everyone contributes. Everyone contributes." So what we're going to do now is drop a little poll into the Zoom here and ask folks to respond to the poll. There's 2 questions we're going to ask you in the poll in just a minute, thinking about what is going to perhaps be most challenging for you in terms of really bringing inclusive change to your school or district. And then we're going to have another question around what you think might be the easiest. So take a moment to fill this out, please. So again, what do you think would be the greatest challenge in bringing inclusive changes to your school? Is it changing mindsets of your colleagues and leadership team? Is it not enough time? Is it budget constraints? Is it not having the resources? Is it the amount of time it might take to plan? Or is it leadership support?
Responses are still coming in, Sam.
Great.
We have 92 out of 124 responses.
All right, let's give folks a couple more moments here. Again, we're asking folks to complete a poll. Oh, I know, I know Sarah just wrote in the chat to me, so hard to pick just one. I know it could be a combination of a couple, but just like your gut response based on like what you heard this afternoon and thinking about your own learning community, what's your gut response? All right, Janelle, it looks like the numbers are, oh, no, we're getting some more.
Just about there.
But it is interesting. It really looks like mindset kind of overwhelmingly is a big barrier that folks are anticipating in bringing this work to their school or district.
Yeah, we hear this often. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, Sam.
Do we want to share the results?
Oh, yep.
So if you look up on the screen, you should see the results here. It's kind of interesting. If you have any thoughts, comments, feel free to drop that in the chat. But 55% of you on tonight's webinar said that mindsets is going to be the biggest barrier in terms of bringing inclusive change to your school. Next was budget, 23%, followed by leadership support at 22%. Followed by planning at 19%, and followed by time at 18%. So that's so interesting, right? So what I'm seeing is that we have the time to do this work, but we don't have folks committed to the work because of a lack of mindset shift. Yeah, it's true, Emily. And I'm glad to see, though, that people aren't really thinking about budget or leadership as much of a barrier. And, and this could be a great question to bring to your own school, right? Kind of see where your colleagues sit with this. All right, so, we can learn as much from what we're expecting is going to be challenging as we can around what we're expecting will be successful. So we're going to pop another question up here. So this question is the opposite. You have the same choices to choose from, but we're asking you, what do you think is the easiest entry point? How do you start getting some buy-in? How do you start building this? Where do you start in your school where you might not get so much pushback like you might with mindset shift?
Sam, this is a great flip to that question. So interesting.
It is so interesting. I love what everyone is writing in the chat too, in terms of just their reflection on this. I think we could do another 90 minutes just about this, Janelle.
I think we could. Well, folks have to come back and see you present at the inclusion conference for more.
Yeah, we'll have to make sure we drop that in at the end.
Yeah. So we still have responses coming in.
Give folks another moment here if you haven't yet made a selection. Again, the question is, where do you see an entry point to creating inclusive opportunities for students in your school or district? Mindset, time, budget, resources, planning, and or leadership support. Oh, I love that quote that someone just put in the chat. A goal without a plan is just a wish. right? We've got to have the vision. We've got to have the plan.
All right, we have 99 folks out of 125 responded. Almost there, it's still climbing.
You can try to pick two. We'd like you to just pick one if you can.
I don't know if it'll, I didn't.
But we're inclusive here. We'll let you pick two. All right, I think we're pretty close to the end here.
Go ahead and share the results.
So looking here, and again, keep the conversation going in the chat here as a community of learners. Where do you see an entry point? It looks like biggest entry point is leadership support, 36%. Second entry point is planning time, 29%. Next entry point is mindset at 23%. Resources at 21%. Time at 10%, and budget at 7%, right? So again, we can't always use, schools don't have money as an excuse to do this work. So again, feel free to throw your chats. Thanks for everybody for participating in that. Thanks, Taylor. I love like the stories that you share that are like real life, right? Because it's one thing to be here at the end of the workday and talk about all this stuff, but to be able to hear stories of kind of on the grounds, what's worked and what's been challenging could be so powerful, I think, for all of us in this field. All right. So what we're going to do is now open it up to Q&A. I know that there have been a lot of questions that have been dropped into the Q&A box and some into the chat over the last hour and 15 minutes. And so what I'd like to do is we're going to take the next 10 minutes or so to open it up to questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Janelle from Support Inclusive Practices to pick some questions and throw them at me.
Yeah, so Sam, the first question we have, and I would encourage folks to continue adding and I will collect them, but the first is, I'm curious, what is the best way to introduce young children, so in particular TK through first grade, to supporting meaningful inclusion if they have not been exposed to children that have special needs in the general education classroom?
I think that's a great question. I would say the two best ways to do it is through children's literature, first and foremost, and videos, right? It's always easier to introduce a concept in a fictional way first than it is to introduce it in a real life way. So there's a whole host of really great picture books out there that feature characters with disabilities. There's tons of those videos, kind of like the one I showed you earlier, but that are more geared towards younger students. So that I think it's a great way to do it. I also think it's about breaking down this idea that differences or disabilities is necessarily a bad or negative thing, right? So it's helping, especially young kids, explore differences that are tangible first. So differences like our hair color, our height, who's in our family, color of our skin, the language we speak, right? Start with those differences. Start by exploring those differences. And then from there, once we're comfortable talking about those differences, recognizing the value in those differences and that diversity is a positive, from there, you can go to talking more about specific disabilities. And then from there, you go to, okay, so how do we outside on the playground recognize that some of us have black hair, some of us have blonde hair, some of us might see differently, some of us might hear differently. So how can we play with everybody in an inclusive way?
Yeah, really honoring and celebrating those differences. I have a few ideas for books that I'll throw in the chat as you're answering the next question, Sam. Also, one of the questions that came in was about a book list that we could put together for folks and add to the Padlet. I know in the last series we talked about that, and we're still working on getting that added to the Padlet. So we'll go ahead and add book lists to both Padlet so folks can easily access those.
Yes, those will be up there by the end of this week. And there'll be both picture and chapter books, and they'll be divided up by different, what I would call category of disability. So books that feature characters who live on the autism spectrum will have a chunk. Books that feature students who live with Down syndrome will have a chunk, et cetera, et cetera. And I would really encourage you to think about, I know a lot of schools are getting, some additional funding right now to support equity, inclusion. Think about working with your administrator and your school librarian to order some of these books while you have these extra funds. And I would even suggest putting them on a separate shelf in your school library, like just for teacher resources to start. So it's really, really easy for teachers to access them rather than having to kind of dig through and see if a kid already checked them out or something like that.
Great idea, Sam. So another question is statement and question. I'm struggling to put these ideas together. Students with learning differences needing to be accommodated for in the classroom through UDL, which I know benefits all, while at the same time expecting them to be able to reach the same end goals as those without learning differences. How can we keep our expectations high, yet reasonable, given the unique circumstances for students with educational disabilities?
It's a great question. And I think, part of it, it goes back to mindset change, right? Like we're used to this, we have all the standardized testing, right? Like we're used to every student actually achieving the same thing. Actually, a very interesting thing. I was just listening to the radio. I love this talk show about child psychology, and they had some guy on, and apparently the SATs are going to be moving all online. And one of the things that they're going to be able to do with this new SAT all online with the math portion is based on how you respond to part one, the next set of questions are going to be responsive to kind of where you are in your mathematical aptitude, which I think is really interesting. And it relates to this question, right? Which is, how do we think about the end goal, right? Like, what are those standards that we're trying to achieve that we need students to achieve, but recognizing there's different ways that students achieve that and different ways that students demonstrate their knowledge. So it really goes back to kind of the personalized learning plans that a lot of schools are doing. And I would say it's a mindset shift, right? We have to help some educators recognize that not all 20 students, success doesn't look the same for all 20 students, right? And so what does success look like for each student individually? And I think sometimes teachers just don't know how to do that. So what I would suggest is building, like kind of how I built that template of the inclusion checklist for you, and all you had to do is fill it in. Build out some sort of matrix or visual graphic organizer that educators can fill in that's kind of pre-made with some suggestions to get the gears turning. I think a lot of this is educators, myself included, right? We're very conditioned to think within a box. And so if you don't know the frameworks, the structures, the potential templates outside of the box, you're never going to get there.
All right, the next question's coming in from high school teacher, 10th and 11th grade. Our district has lots of turnover annually, it seems, at the executive level. As such, the inclusion model or vision is all over the place. We teachers of inclusion feel hung out to dry. Any suggestions as to how to achieve that leadership support? It feels like an uphill battle, and any suggestions are much appreciated.
That is a tough one. And I've worked with a lot of schools that have that leadership turnover. And unfortunately, when that happens, you are kind of always starting from the ground up every time. And sometimes you have leaders who are willing to come in and kind of pick up where you already are, as maybe teachers who've been there way longer than the administrators. And other times you have leaders that come in and are like, well, we're just redoing all this. I think one of the things that I might suggest is couple of things. Making sure your plan is documented, Because I think if your plan is just kind of visionary, that can be really hard for folks, for new administrators to wrap their head around, right? Because if you just come in and kind of have the vision, leadership is like, well, I don't like that vision, or I'm going to change this part of the vision. But if you come in and you're like, this is our 5-year plan, you are joining our school district on year 3. We want to show you what we've done the last 2 years and what is on the docket for this year, and get your input and support in this. I think that can be stronger as a way to kind of go in. I also think you mentioned in the question inclusion teachers. So I don't know if it's just the inclusion teachers in your school that are on board with this, or all the teachers, but I would also encourage you to ensure that all the teachers are on board.
Sam, I really appreciate that approach, because we know that this work is a continuous improvement process, and it's not uncommon to enter in one place within the system and go backwards and then go forwards in other places. We see this really commonly. So to have that documented in a way that can be visualized for anyone in the system is a really helpful strategy. So another question, are there recommendations or guides out there for shifting the way school districts structure their way of setting up and assigning teachers and students to a general education or special education class, so it's more blended or co-taught?
So the first part of that question was, are there systems,
recommendations or guides?
So there are guides out there, 100%. I think there might be a couple in the Padlet that I might have linked to. I can't remember exactly. There are some guides out there, but again, I hate to beat a dead horse, but I think it goes back to mindset. One of the things that I think could be really powerful in a school, though, is, success brings success. And sometimes this could be really scary. So I think kind of finding within your school a couple educators that would pilot more of a blended learning approach is a really good way to do it, and to be able to get that administrative buy-in before the start of the school year. Don't wait till the start of the school year. Get the buy-in now. Go to your administrator and say, hey, I'm a special educator. This is second grade teacher so-and-so. We have this idea that we would like to try out next year. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to hire any additional people. We just want your endorsement, and here's what it's going to look like and sound like and feel like. And, we'd like, some time at the beginning of the school year to share about our plan with others. We'd like some time in the middle of the school year at a staff training to share our progress. We want to invite our colleagues into this classroom. I think, again, it's starting that 10%, right? So let's say you have, 100 classrooms in your school. You start with one classroom, and that's 10%. So I think that could be a really beneficial strategy, right? Rather than trying to change the mindset of everybody, just, start with who's already bought into it.
Yeah, great suggestion. Start small, learn and practice, grow from there. We can also add some resources on the Padlet, suggestions on master scheduling. So there are some things for leaders to start thinking about as they're creating master schedules, to make sure that general and special educators can come together and collaborate around things like a co-teaching model or collaborative teaching model.
I'm actually working on another project with a school district, and we're calling it the All Means All inclusion pilot. And we're finding just a couple classrooms, and I'm actually going to work very closely with them as kind of like a coach throughout the year, and really build that and hopefully demonstrate to the rest of these schools and then the higher county office of ed, like, this does work, and we've got a proven method here.
Absolutely. Excellent. So a couple more questions coming in. What can we do if the relationship between general education and special education teachers becomes strained and we butt heads? What happens when we can't work together with our co-teaching partners?
That's a big one. I remember being a gen ed teacher and struggling with that even, and I'm sure the special educator I was working with was struggling with that. And I think that's especially true for more of those, tier 3 kids, those really severe kids, especially those EBD, emotionally behaviorally disturbed, behavior challenges. I think so much of that is like a personality HR issue. So it's hard for me to give specific, suggestions at this point, but I do think, going back to that common vision, common mission, and kind of, setting the stage. I used to always meet with, as a gen ed teacher, I used to always meet with the special educator at the beginning of the year and go through all the IEPs and get to know the kids a little bit. But that didn't necessarily happen if I didn't suggest that, right? And not all gen ed and not all special educators are going to make that suggestion. So I would say, put your foot out, and start building that relationship in that way to begin with. And in that meeting, kind of, articulate, hey, I'm really, interested and engaged, empowered, educated, empowered, and inspired, right, to create a more inclusive environment for my students. How could we make that happen? What kind of goals could we have? What kind of mission alignment could we create?
Sam,
Yeah,
the
so
work
Sarah actually in the chat just said, regular meetings are hard to schedule. And that's so true. And almost even, I feel like one of the positives of the pandemic is folks are much more comfortable collaborating virtually. And so maybe look for ways to collaborate virtually as well, like whether that's a Google form that you ask your gen ed teachers to fill out about each of the students in your caseload weekly or bi-weekly, whether that's, like what do they call them? The Google, what were we going to do, Janelle?
the Jamboard.
The Jamboard. You could have a Google Jamboard for each of your students and have Post-it notes. But I think as people are more comfortable kind of using technology, think about ways to collaborate that way. It doesn't always have to be face-to-face anymore.
And I will go ahead and drop a link in the chat, but we do have some specific recorded webinars around co-teaching that offers suggestions on co-planning, master scheduling, some of the things that are coming up right now, how to build that relationship between general and special education teachers. So I'll drop that link in the chat so folks can access that as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad you like that idea, Natalie. And again, I'll make sure that my email gets dropped in the chat again. I'm happy to, hop on a call offline and help anyone kind of build out some frameworks in this way.
And there were other questions specific to trainings that you might offer, Sam. So about whether you offer growth mindset trainings. And so do you want to just drop your email in the chat again for anyone who's asking for specific trainings?
Sure, yes, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to you about all the different things that, I think there's so many different ways that this work kind of goes. There's so many different audiences that we can adapt to. So yeah, happy to connect with anybody.
All right, great. Evelyn, I think those questions came from you. So make sure to reach out to Sam directly so you all can schedule a time to talk about some trainings. There's one more question I think we have time for, and then a survey. What about students with behaviors, for example, hitting, screaming, so more extreme behaviors that might be distracting to everyone? How can we include them?
So those are what I would call the invisible disabilities. And it is much easier, for the most part, to include and help students develop empathy for students with visible disabilities than it is those invisible disabilities. So first of all, I would start in the lower risk area on the visible disabilities than it is on the invisible disabilities. I think when it comes to including those students, we want to go back to those questions around physical inclusion related to sensory input and design of spaces, because we find that a lot of times it is sensory inputs or space design which can sometimes be the antecedent to a behavior, as well as some of the social inclusion, right? Feeling not seen, not heard, feeling anxious, feeling overwhelmed, feeling upset, right? Like we always want to think about, any kind of ABAs on here or BCBAs, right? Like there's an antecedent to every behavior, right? So really being thoughtful and thinking about the ways in which our structures, our sounds, our lights, our environment can be conducive to students needs to limit those behaviors, but we also need to recognize that those behaviors do not just eliminate. And so that when we think about creating an inclusive environment, we're also coaching all of our students to say, you know, sometimes we might have to leave the classroom, and that's okay. I remember when I was teaching third grade, it was a tough year. We had to evacuate the classroom about once a week for one particular student. But I really worked with my students proactively in talking about what does that mean when we, you know, I didn't say evacuate the classroom, but, you know, what does it mean when we have to go to the library sometimes, right? And my students became really well versed where they didn't, you know, this one particular student's escalated behavior did not escalate the other students. And they knew, oh, that's just so-and-so having a hard time. We're going to bring our snacks and go to the library right now, right? So there's ways that we can make it work. So I want to thank everybody for all these amazing questions, the conversation in the chat, supporting inclusive practices, for the opportunity to be here, for all of you for joining us. We do have 2 more upcoming trainings, so I want to put a plug in for those. So let me just reshare my screen here. So the next 2 trainings that we have coming up are going to really be geared more towards parents and families. Each training will be simultaneously translated into Spanish. The power of inclusion in and beyond the school. So helping parents and families in the first training, which is, whoa, February 3rd is this Thursday. This Thursday, around what is inclusion and why is it important for them as parents of students. And then on February 8th, really helping parents raise more inclusive and empathetic young people. So a link to that will be thrown into the chat to register. And then there's also a link going into the chat for the survey that we're asking you to complete, as this is the second part of a 2-part series around becoming an inclusion change maker.
Thank you so much. And we encourage you all to share the family parent training opportunities with folks within your organization. We hope to see as many families and parents there. Please complete the brief survey for us, dropping it in the chat right now. And Sam, cannot thank you enough for your amazing support and everything that you have provided to us in the past, we've been together for a few weeks now. Some excellent training and really just the inspiration, thought-provoking questions, conversations. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. We appreciate you and look forward to seeing you soon.
And thanks for the shirt, Janelle. I love the visual support here. Sam loves SIP too.
And thank you to Dawn who made these shirts for us. Yours is in the mail, Sam.
All right, awesome. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
All right, folks, the survey link has been dropped in that chat, so please grab it on your way out, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.